Hey you, take Surge out of your killer builds. So Surge is a weird perk in Dead by Daylight that ends up being a major noob trap the more that you think about it, to the point where it is functionally the weakest regression perk in the game. In most builds, replacing Surge with a perk that suits the killer better would be a more preferable option holistically, and this may come as a surprise to some people, seeing as Surge is one of the most used perks in the game, and it's a regression perk, and DBD law states that regression perks are just never bad. To sum it up in a very quick phrase, Surge is kind of like the windows of opportunity of killer perks, in the sense that it does something, but it ends up being a crutch perk that stands to detriment most players, especially when something with stronger and more consistent utility could replace it. Now obviously if you have nothing better to use and you want to use Surge, then fine, I'm not going to stop you from doing that, but this video is going to talk about how it just really doesn't live up to its potential. To Surge's credit, it is a useful perk in certain situations. Indoor maps, and especially maps with multiple layers like the game or the Raccoon City maps or even Forgotten Ruins, stand to get the most value out of it. That, and if survivors end up 3-genning themselves and play in an overly altruistic manner near priority generators, then Surge ends up being more powerful than any other regression perk in the game. But these are exceptions, and they rely on either bad map design or blatant mistakes from the survivors. And so, Surge is the perennial potential man perk that can get more value if things go the right way, at which point you can probably understand the caveat of the perk's opportunity cost. So let's take a look at what Surge actually does though, so that I can explain why it's not as strong as some people might think. Whenever a survivor is put into the dying state with a basic attack, all generators within 32 meters explode, lose 8% total progress, and start regressing. That first part, where it requires a basic attack to activate, already alienates the vast majority of the cast that it uses or occasionally uses a special attack to down their targets. For example, the Pig is somewhat known for being a relatively weak basic attack killer, but running Surge further discourages her from using her dash attack since it would partially invalidate the perk's potential use case scenarios. If we limit the scope of optimal Surge users to killers that need to use a basic attack to down survivors 100% of the time with no possibility of using their powers to down a survivor, that shortens the list to 14 characters who get guaranteed value from the perk. For the sake of simplicity and argument, I have excluded characters that have niche secondary abilities like Houndmaster's Vault Injuries or Freddy's Pallets, so even though these killers do down survivors with their basic attacks 95% of the time, it's those exceptions that make it so that they're not perfect Surge users like the Ghoul or the Deathslinger. In other words, when you knock a survivor down through proper niche ability use, then Surge loses a potentially good activation. Sorry gamer, guess you should not have tried using your kit to its fullest potential because Surge is sitting there like the festering mold in J.K. Rowling's home. Relatively speaking, the only high tier killers that do get guaranteed value out of Surge are Singularity, Spirit, and Kaneki, and past that, most of the killers that get guaranteed value from Surge are fairly mid to low tier killers, at which point the lower tier killers need a much stronger perk to make up for their relative weaknesses. The aforementioned strong killers don't want Surge in their builds because their relative strength is what allows them greater flexibility in their perk options. So what makes Surge so terrible to begin with is the numbers that are attached to it. 32 meters is pretty short in Dead by Daylight terms, considering that it's the average distance the game uses to indicate killer proximity. It is a distance that is deemed so relatively short that some killers with greater mobility have been granted a larger tear radius. This means that the only generators that are affected by this perk are the ones that are in proximity to the killer, which, if the chase is being led near a generator with high progress or high priority, then that is a positioning mistake from the survivors. Any competent survivor or anybody with sprint burst will be able to make distance away from those active generators, and in most situations that means that any survivor who is playing the game half decently will only allow 1 or 2 generators to get hit by this perk at any time. And even if they're not actively playing around Surge, this further highlights how the perk is largely benefited from bad players and bad map design, because the only time that a killer should be able to get multiple activations of this perk per match is when survivors cannot make distance away from their active generators. Furthermore, due to the range requirement, the generators that are most affected by this perk are likely lower priority ones, as the player that the killer chases off might be the only person working on that generator at that time, while others will still get completed across the map. And even if they're not the only person working on that specific generator, Surge only takes out a 7.2 second chunk from that gen, which can be easily undone if a second person swoops in to make up for the person being chased. 7.2 seconds also doesn't account for the 2.6 second basic attack cooldown, meaning that the killer will actually only get 4.6 seconds of regression on any generator that is being actively repaired within 32 meters. That is to say, in a situation where you tag a distant generator that someone is working on, which is more likely to happen, Surge actually only applies 5.1% generator regression, which is functionally identical to kicking the generator without perks anyway. The difference between this and other generator regression perks is that the other regression perks hit harder and allow you to apply it to full regression immediately, whereupon you can get to your next task right away. Surge's effect is so passive that it actually can eat into the efficiency of how killers like to prioritize their tasks. Now, assuming that the killer doesn't take the time to pick up the survivor they've just knocked down and they instead want to immediately approach the generator that's actively being repaired after they've activated Surge, then they only have 4.6 seconds to approach, meaning that any generator that is greater than 21 meters away will have Surge's regression washed away completely. And due to the way that Dead by Daylight is designed, if you do happen to use Surge on a nearby generator, it can no longer be kicked, which then creates anti-synergy with perks that would otherwise require you to do so. Basically, Surge just doesn't play well with others. This means that you can't use Pop Goes the Weasel, a much stronger option on stronger killers, or Eruption, a stronger option on the weaker killers. It also prevents you from using perks that have greater utilities, such as Nowhere to Hide, Trail of Torment, Unforeseen, or even Machine Learning, and technically it ruins the ability to run Brutal Strength as well, since you can't kick a gen that's been hit by Surge. And while we're on the topic, the reason why Eruption is seen as a superior option is because it guarantees 15% regression off of any generator, 5% for the initial kick, which you don't lose time on because you can start chases right after you kick it, and then 10% for when it activates. Surge always only gets 8% at most per activation. Eruption also allows you to pick where you want to maintain your pressure, allowing you more flexibility to dictate where you can take chase, since you'll always be guaranteed regression on the generators you select, which can also be applied to multiple generators at once across the map. Surge basically begs the survivors to take chases near their generators so that the killer can regress them for roughly half the value that Eruption gets on one generator. We also can't forget that Eruption gives aura reading on anybody actively repairing the marked generator, letting the killer know which one needs to be made a priority, and it works 100% of the time, without exceptions, on every killer's power. Some killers, when they use their powers as well, have a shorter cooldown period after they land their powers, so they're able to then chase after survivors while also getting a larger regression penalty. Some people may argue that Eruption hits the gen kick limit faster, but Surge can also be just as harmful by claiming its 8% stake on generators that don't need that kind of attention in the moment. It's generally pretty rare that I find myself hitting the gen kick limit with Eruption, but I do find that Surge can occasionally regress a gen at less than 5% progress multiple times and screw me out of a potential late game hold. If I apply Eruption to a gen 4 times and I still get nothing out of it despite the advantages that it creates, then that's more on me for being bad at the game at that point. The main reason that people still run Surge, and the real problem with it, is that it still is one of the better killer perks, because bad Survivor players are just about everywhere, indoor maps are annoyingly common, and most other killer perks are categorically awful. Being able to hold down a 3-gen is significantly easier with this perk as well, and it is admittedly satisfying to be able to regress generators with it. However, if you are a budding Kaneki or Singularity player, I would highly suggest picking up Pop Goes the Weasel, as it allows you to kick a generator that you choose for 20% of its progress. If you're playing Deathslinger or Clown or any basic attack killer with lower mobility, try Eruption instead so that you can maintain longer distant chases with fewer consequences. Now, I'm obviously not your parent and I can't tell you what to do, but I hope I've given you consideration for why you should consider alternate perks to Surge. Heck, consider running an info or aura reading or anti-healing perk in its place and see what utility it gives you comparatively, because Surge just ain't gonna cut it. And that is the last video that I have for all of you until I get my life sorted out. Thank you all so much for watching, safe travels, and goodbye.